All right, I'm going to take off the neck gaiter. These are really nice, by the way, the neck gaiters. Anyone else have a neck gaiter here? Has everyone got a traditional? See, I don't have to worry about the ears. We are living in evil and suffering. The pain on the ears, the coronavirus. What are we to think about the existence of evil and suffering in our society and the existence of God? The problem of evil and suffering is perhaps the biggest objection to the Christian faith. It can be parsed out in a few different ways, and we're going to go through some of those variations. But I think it is the largest reason why people do not believe in God. It's the most common one. And this problem of evil can be described as the contention between the existence of evil and the existence of God. And the first way we're going to look at that, if I get the clicker going here. Ooh. Oh, too far. No, is that the first slide? I'm not sure the clicker is working. Okay. Oh, silly me. On. There we go. Okay. So the three ways we can parse it out are the logical, evidential, and relational problems of evil. So let's take sort of a big perspective, the problem of evil, and we can break it down into three different varieties of objections. Okay, these aren't what we would call evils themselves, but these are terms that we can use to describe the type of objection that we might see or we read about online. So I'm going to go through each of these three, and at each point we'll have time for Q&A, and when I'm done, again, we could just have a nice conversation. If you have different questions about these issues, I will try to answer them as best as I can. So the logical problem of evil. This is the idea that the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent God, those are big terms, omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and benevolent, sometimes omnibenevolent, all good God, and the existence of evil are either inconsistent or contradictory. Okay? These things cannot exist at the same time. This is the logical problem of evil, and it was first to the best of our knowledge, posited by a Greek philosopher named Epicurus. And he wrote, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" Of course, he said it in Greek and wrote it in Greek. I was giving you English, There's another philosopher, more part of what's called the modern era, named David Hume. He was Scottish. And he echoed these same sentiments as Epicurus. Hume wrote, "Is he willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil?" Why is there evil? So this is a concern that philosophers have had for a long time, and everyday people have had for a long time. That the existence of God, if he's good, all-powerful, all-knowing, that he wouldn't create a world where there's evil. And yet here we see and experience evil and suffering. So either God is not all-powerful or all good, or he doesn't exist. And atheists and agnostics will frequently say that, well, he just doesn't exist. Sometimes there might be, you might say, people middle of the road, cautious believers that may question God's attributes, that he's not all powerful or he's not all good. And they question these things. And even in the biblical text, we see some of these questions appear as well, and we'll get into that. Now, when we say that the omnis and evil are contradictory, we need to ask ourselves, what is a contradiction? Because sometimes you may have competing claims, and they may be different, but that doesn't mean that they are a contradiction. So when I talk about a contradiction, I mean, to use sort of a technical term, A or not A. So if I were to say Dr. J is on the stage, Dr. J is not on the stage, right? Those are contradictory terms. That's sort of a clearer example. An unclearer example might be like apples versus oranges, right? Those are different things, but they're not in the strictest, narrower sense a contradiction. They're only a contradiction when you get them into narrower terms. So a narrower term would be like an apple and not an apple. That would be a contradiction, okay? Why is that important to understand about what a contradiction is? Well, when we look at the logical problem of evil, when we think about the omni-attributes, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and we think about evil, where is the contradiction? Where is it that those two different things are incompatible? That is, they don't work together. And that's a question that's been posed to atheist philosophers and scholars in the academic literature. And that's a question that's gone on unanswered. No one has shown how it is that the existence of evil and God's existence with the omni-attributes are a contradiction. I mean, it seems like, yeah, man, if God is all good and he knows everything, so he sees what's coming and he makes that even happen because he's omnipotent, why would there be evil in the world? Now, we're going to get into some of those questions, some of those answers about why God might bring about evil into the world. Not that he's the author of evil, but that evil still comes about in this world that he has created. We'll get into some of those reasons. But at first glance, we don't really see a contradiction, do we? Now, maybe Christians can come up with an idea or an explanation that would defeat the possibility of a contradiction from even occurring. And this is what one philosopher has done. This philosopher is named Alvin Plantinga. He's now retired. Used to teach at the University of Notre Dame. And he has brought in what he's called the free will defense. And this is different from a term that's called a theodicy, but this is a free will defense. And he says that if God creates the world in such a way that there are free creatures who can choose to do good or evil, and that nothing before them causes them, that is, forces them to do the action, that if these creatures are truly free, this would explain why evil comes about. So here's God, and he's all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful. He creates the world, which includes free creatures. He creates free creatures. And sometime down the road, the free creatures use their free will, and evil is brought into the world. This would explain how there is, at the least, what we'll call moral evil, that there's moral evil in the world. And so we can see how there is an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God and the existence of evil. So this is, in a very basic sense, the free will defense. And this explanation by Plantinga has been well received by atheists in the academic community, like William Rowe and J.L. Mackie. Those are some names. You don't have to remember them, but those are atheist philosophers. So even the atheists believe that Alvin Plantinga has solved the logical problem of evil. Fascinating that in the academic world of debate, there is a whole community that says, no, actually, we're good to go on that. Let's move on. And so they have moved their attention from the logical problem of evil to the evidential problem of evil. Truly, they consider the logical problem of evil done for, no good anymore. But what's this evidential problem of evil? Well, if you'll recall, the logical problem of evil posits the inconsistency or the outright contradiction between the existence of evil and the existence of God, or at least the omni-attributes. What the evidential problem of evil does is says that the existence of God is improbable given the extent of evil or some gratuitous instance of evil. Gratuitous meaning unnecessary or unexplainable. That there's just so much evil in the world, and there are such awful ways and forms of evil that we see, that Conway shared with some of us, that it just doesn't make sense why God would allow these things. And so it's improbable that God exists. You see, that's a more modest claim to make. So that makes it a lot harder, I think, for the Christian to tackle because it is more modest and because we do see a number of cases of evil that are very hard to understand. Evil and suffering. Some of these things we read in the news, we learn in the history books, we see them for ourselves, we experience them ourselves. And for many people, the problem of evil is a very real problem to them. But let's talk a bit more about the evidential problem of evil. So, with the logical problem of evil, we had considered moral evil. Evil that results because a human chooses to perform some action. Evil and suffering that results because of humans doing human things. What about other forms of evil and suffering, like as a result of natural processes, like a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake? There is suffering that results from that as well, isn't there? So that's one of the core differences between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. It's that there's moral evil and there's natural evil or natural suffering that results, and that these things are difficult to explain, perhaps even gratuitous. They are unnecessary. It doesn't have to be that way, or maybe we don't even know why that's the case, why that evil's there. Why would God allow an earthquake in Nepal that kills over 1,000 people when we could conceive of a world where that earthquake never happened? You can think about Bambi. Any Disney movie lovers? Bambi. Have you seen Bambi? I know it's one of those older Disney films. One of the opening scenes in Bambi, right? You got Bambi, little Bambi, and Bambi's mother. You remember what happens? Bang! Run to the thicket, Bambi. And off Bambi goes. Boy, I'm tugging on Dante's heartstrings here. We all feel that. I mean, here's a big term, the anthropomorphizing of deer, right? We see the human interaction, the human emotion in the face and the actions of the deer. And then we're just bawling our eyes out when Bambi's crying out for mom, mother. So we see this, we understand this natural evil and suffering. William Rowe, one of those philosophy professors, emeritus professor of philosophy, he describes it this way: in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. Couldn't we at least imagine a world where God wouldn't allow that to happen? Why would God allow that to happen? Traditionally, theists have said that there are reasons why this evil happens, even if we don't see it. But these days, there are some theists that are willing to say, no, gratuitous evil exists. It really does. There are some Christians that say this. And here's what's interesting about this. As a point of debate or a point of logic, you could actually grant that gratuitous evil exists. Maybe you think the evidential problem of evil is a problem for the theist. But when you consider that, if you consider that one argument against the existence of God, and you include all these other evidences that you have for the existence of God and for Christian theism specifically, all of this evidence, if you were to put them on a scale, would far outweigh the evidential problem of evil. So even if you were to grant this argument, the evidential problem of evil, as a good argument, it wouldn't, all things considered, lead you to believe that God does not exist, because you have all this other evidence weighing down the scale, right? So I want to say that at the outset, because maybe you're going to disagree with me and the things I'm about to say against gratuitous evil, and that's okay in terms of the big picture. But even still, I think the Christian has a few points worth considering that we should attend to. The first of this is called skeptical theism. Okay? Now, skeptical theism is a term, it doesn't refer to one who is skeptical of theism, but skeptical theism is a term that refers to the idea that even if it appears there are forms of gratuitous evil, there's still an explanation. Maybe we just don't know what that explanation is. Maybe we're not in a place to understand why that evil comes about. So there are good reasons. God has those reasons, but we don't. And Alvin Plantinga, the hero of the logical problem of evil, he says this about the evidential problem. Why suppose that if God does have a good reason for permitting evil, the theist would be the first to know? I want to know, God, what's that reason for that? Why did Bambi have to suffer? Why think that I have to know that, and that I have those reasons? Interestingly enough, when we get to the next problem, or a variety of the problem of evil, we'll see how a biblical author sort of poses that same very question about skeptical theism. But there's another tactic as well that's sort of a part of the skeptical theism camp, and it's a form of chaos theory. Anyone familiar with chaos theory? A butterfly flaps its wings in South Africa, and it sets off a course of events leading to a hurricane in the Gulf Coast, something like that. How many of you have seen the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, 2008, Brad Pitt, Kate Blanchett? Oh, wow. It's a story about a man who's born old and he dies as a baby. Very fascinating plot. But there in the movie, there's a sequence of events where the female protagonist is hit by a car. And what the male protagonist narrates is the sequence of events that resulted in her being hit by the car. That if things were to be even slightly different, if the taxi driver hadn't missed his alarm, or if the shopkeeper wasn't delayed in wrapping a gift, or if the truck driver was driving just a little bit faster, he would have passed by. And the point is that all these different events, which are out of our control, still can result in unexplainable suffering. That is, a human being hit by a car. They're just a variety of factors at play. Imagine a bunch of molecules bouncing off against each other. Eventually, some of them will interfere with us if we were one of those molecules. And so sometimes the cards of life that we're dealt with can just be the result of millions of different life choices that have been made down through the centuries, and we just have to deal with the hand that we're dealt with. So that chaos theory falls sort of within the skeptical theism response that, hey, maybe there are these reasons, but we just don't see these reasons. We don't know why they're there. All right, next I want to talk about theodicy here. What is a theodicy? Well, a theodicy is an attempt to vindicate divine goodness and providence in light of the existence of evil. So there are different forms of theodicy. One of those is called the soul-making theodicy. And it's roughly this. The reason why God creates a world with evil and suffering is because he is not interested in you living a comfy lifestyle. He is interested in bringing about salvific knowledge, that is the knowledge of salvation, and in creating Christ-like persons. There's nothing in the Bible which guarantees us health, wealth, and great pleasures in life, or the life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. In fact, the life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, roughly speaking, is contrary to the Christian worldview. What God's interested in is making souls. And to make souls, we have to go through trials. We have to go through sufferings. James writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Paul writes in Romans, "We also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope." You see, even in the Bible here, we see how our souls are crafted and we become mature individuals. We become more Christ-like. So that's roughly the first form of theodicy, the soul-making. There's also the free will theodicy. So you'll recall the free will defense. Well, the free will theodicy runs roughly the same way, that God wanted to create a world in which humans have freedom to be in relationship with him, right? And so for that reason, God creates free will in humans. And free will brings about the result of moral evil and, as some philosophers have theorized, even natural evil. And maybe we'll get into that in some of the Q&A. All right, we also have natural laws that run the world. Physics, gravity. Conway's a little bit familiar with those. These natural laws were created by God to run the universe. And when they run the universe in such a way, and humans place themselves unknowingly in nature's path, we are bound to suffer from what the natural world does so that the natural world can function. So why are there earthquakes? Well, you should learn about plate tectonics. And as it happens to be the case, humans habitate in zones where plates function in different ways. Sometimes they go like this, sometimes they go like this, and earthquakes happen. Lastly, mystery. Job 1 tells us that Satan wreaks havoc without reason. And Ecclesiastes 8 says, "There is something else meaningless that occurs on earth, righteous men who get what the wicked deserve, and wicked men who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless," writes the author of Ecclesiastes. There are a variety of factors that play into the cosmos, and sometimes we just don't know what the reasons are for why there's evil and suffering, and that's okay. The biblical text, I would argue, suggests that's okay. We don't have all the answers. There's just a mystery about human life. Lastly, relational, and I'll be a little faster here. An individual doubts God's existence or is angry at God in light of their own experiences of evil and suffering. The book of Habakkuk, which is only 3 chapters long right here, it's just 4 pages in your pew Bible, talks about that. It talks about why the wicked prosper. Why doesn't God judge these people? Why does God use the evil people, those Babylonians, to judge the righteous people? Habakkuk goes through this back and forth with God. Very similar to the book of Job. Habakkuk and Job deal with this. And it's a relational problem. Why is it relational? Well, Job and Habakkuk aren't doubting God's existence. They talk to God. They ask him questions. It's a relational one. They're angry. You see, today, atheists will use the problem of evil to say God doesn't exist. This is an intellectual or analytical question that they have in their minds. The relational problem of evil is, in that sense, a horse of a different color. Okay? And it requires a different response, which I'll talk about shortly. C.S. Lewis remarks that the problem of evil was the reason why he had been an atheist. C.S. Lewis, have any of you heard of the Chronicles of Narnia? Okay, how about Mere Christianity or Miracles? I love that. Screwtape Letters, some other writings. Great prolific author in the 20th century. He says, I was at this time living like so many atheists or anti-theists in a whirl of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. How many of you are angry with Smaug, the dragon that lives in the lonely mountain? Anyone angry here? I had one hand. Yes. We're not angry with fictional things that truly do not exist. What is it in humans that are angry with things that allegedly do not exist? You see, there's something deeper that's going on here for people. And sometimes it goes beyond even the issue of God, but it can be very personal, familial, something in their family upbringing perhaps that's caused some hurt in their life. And this can reflect and transpose onto their beliefs about God. That's why the relational problem of evil is a horse of a different color. It's the same horse as the logical and evidential problems of evil because it's a problem of evil, but this one has stripes. It's a little different and it requires a different response. Because if someone is dealing with the relational problem of evil, even if you don't know it, they might not be looking for an analytical response. Oh, well, Alvin Plantinga has this free will defense, and that's why evil exists. If the person dealing with the relational problem of evil is asking questions, what they might be looking for is not an answer, but a hug, or some time in community with someone. Maybe they're feeling lonely. It requires a different response than just stock answers. So that's why it's really important for the Christian to be observant about this, because we need to change how we're going to respond and answer to people, especially if they're hurting in their lives. And sometimes, too, it's good to know these things because we ourselves have been dealing with evil and suffering, maybe. And maybe we're trying to find that analytical response when really we need counseling. We have own skeletons in our closets that we haven't dealt with. So it can be helpful for ourselves to recognize these varieties of the problem of evil, so that way we can be prescribed the right medicine. All right, with that, I want to open it up for Q&A. There's a recap of the varieties, the logical, evidential, and relational, sometimes called the religious or emotional. It goes by different names. I've tried to call it the relational problem of evil, but other philosophers writing on the subject call it religious or emotional. So happy to open it up for questions and possible answers. I say possible because maybe we don't have that answer, and that's okay. That's an easy answer. Any questions about the problem of evil and suffering? It's a doozy. It's, I think, the most common objection to the Christian faith. I'm using an analogy when I say evil is a horse. So if the logical problem of evil is a horse, let's say it's blue, not blue, let's say brown and black hair. The evidential problem of evil maybe is a white horse with brown hair. And the relational problem of evil is a zebra. It's a very different looking horse, but it's still a horse. It's an analogy. Zebras are not horses. Yeah, they are. Definitely are. All right. How much control does Satan have over the world? That's a very great question. And there are Christian philosophers and theologians that are going to disagree over exactly how much control Satan has. There's going to be a spectrum. Some will believe very little, that God has only given Satan so much power. And others are going to say, actually, God's given Satan some pretty free reign around these parts. So there are different perspectives on that. I'm happy to give my own view, which is probably leans more towards the more free reign camp. Like I said, the book of Job, in the prologue, chapter 1, Satan wreaks havoc without reason. God gives Satan that authority over this realm. Ephesians talks about the powers of darkness. So there's a whole theology or doctrine. There's demonology. Again, Christians are going to disagree on this, but that's a very good question about the spiritual world. I once had a debate over the radio in London, England, on this subject, actually. It was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was taking the position that there are things that go unseen, and we don't know why these things happen, why there's evil and suffering. There's a whole spiritual realm that's beyond our senses. And there are some Christians, I think, that go too far and try to put names on these things and explain these things. But the whole point is that it's a realm that we don't see. In the book of Daniel, we're told that Daniel's praying for help, and an angel comes to him and says, "Oh, sorry, I was delayed." "I'm sorry? You were delayed? Doing what?" "Oh, I was fighting a prince in a foreign land," he says. That's the angel saying that. So, assuming, let's just say for the sake of argument, assuming there are angels and demons and that they're doing things, well, they could be busy fighting wars we're not knowing about. And we just don't know it. So there may not be any, the point is there may not be any particular reason why an infant is sexually abused by an aunt or uncle. That happens. There might not be a divine particular reason why God allowed that to happen. There's stuff going on we don't even know about. That's sort of the point. Whereas other Christian philosophers and theologians want to say, oh, there's something going on in your life. You got sin you haven't dealt with. That explains why that evil and suffering came about. So again, Christians have different views, but very good question and a difficult question to answer. And it impacts how we counsel Christians. It impacts how we understand evil and suffering in our own lives. I just want to say that there is this broad scope that's worth exploring. It's a lot of fun, at least for me, to study that subject. Down here, yeah. So theodicy is a term which refers to the attempt to vindicate divine providence, that is God's work and action in the world, and the existence of evil. There are different theodicies: soul-making, free will theodicy. You've got mystery. There are other forms of theodicy that do not contradict. So you could come up with what you might call a model of divine providence, which incorporates many of these theodicies, and that all of them collectively explain the world that we perceive and live in. So we can see times where God is crafting someone's soul. They're going through a hard time. God's working with them. Maybe some of the evil and suffering is a result of their own life choices, but God's still working with them. So, a man destroys his marriage out of his own free will. He repents, but he still lives with that suffering that he himself is the cause of. You see that soul-making. Sometimes you see someone suffering through no result of their own. That's the book of Job. That's what Job's about. And he grapples with these questions. And he even questions God's character. He says God's unfair. He says, maybe if there were a mediator between you and me, God, I could figure out why this is happening to me. That's what Job says. That doesn't jive with our typical conception of Christianity, right? That someone's questioning God's character. Read the Psalms. You see that as well with David. So the biblical authors grappled with these questions, and they wondered why God did these things. So if you find yourself doing the very same thing, you're not alone at all. Just read the biblical text. See what the other authors believed and what they felt in their times of suffering. Sorry, I was going on, but that was a question about Theodicy. Yeah. Any other questions? I saw some other hands. Gratuitous evil. Gratuitous would be unnecessary or unexplainable evil. Evil that is not justifiable. There's no good reason why that had to come about. So the suffering of Holocaust victims appears to be gratuitous. Couldn't we imagine a world where the Holocaust never happened? Couldn't God have created the world, a society, in such a way that Hitler never rose to power? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe God has, because of his creating a world with free creatures, he's now restricted himself to the things he can bring about. And that if certain things, if he were to tinker certain levers and adjust human history in such a way, maybe we would have seen a different type of Hitler, a worse type of Hitler. And it's interesting, any comic book fans in here, you sort of get these alternate worlds or these multiverse theories where on Earth 99, it's a world in which the Nazis succeed. Or there's an Amazon Prime, well, maybe you guys haven't seen this, but there's a series called Man in the High Castle, and it's a hypothesis that what happens if the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II. So it's intriguing to see how the human mind might think about these alternative scenarios. And similarly, we might think, hey, well, yeah, maybe killing baby Hitler brings about some worse evil. That's a reference to a thought experiment, by the way. If you kill baby Hitler, right, would you have prevented the Holocaust? Maybe not. Maybe something worse would have come about. And of course, you got all sorts of moral issues there, like Hitler didn't do anything wrong as a baby. So philosophers have some very intriguing thought experiments. And, all right, we've got a few more minutes. Question there. Yep, and back. Very good. Christian philosophers and theologians disagree, sometimes fiercely, on this question, the relationship between divine sovereignty and human freedom. There are different camps called incompatibilists and compatibilists. Those are philosophical terms. Theologically, there are some that refer to themselves as Calvinists, Arminians. Lutherans typically get shafted in that debate. There's a pseudo-camp called Calminians. Those are typically people who just can't make heads or tails of it, and they just try to hold some sense of an in-between. There's an account of divine providence and divine foreknowledge called Molinism. Anyone heard that term, Molinism? So you've studied this then a little bit. One moment here. Yeah, so Molinism is this attempt to say that, well, God sees all these futures, these feasible worlds, and he picks one. So that's where you get the sense of divine foreknowledge. But allegedly, the human is still free when that event plays out, if you will. So there are sort of attempts and models to reconcile how humans can still be free in light of divine sovereignty. But it's sort of an age-old question Christians have been dealing with for at least 1,500 years. And I have my own view, but I'm happy to explain different views to help people see that, hey, there are different ways of understanding these issues. I frequently think that Protestants, which I consider myself one, have misunderstood grace and free will, that these two terms are not contradictory, but work in conjunction together. So it's not, when a human makes a free choice action, That doesn't mean it's only the human making that choice. But also, I still grant that it is the human making the choice. It's not some prior action which causes the human to make that choice. It can get very technical. But yeah, maybe we'll chat more about lunch. But did you have a follow-up question? What's that? Foreknowledge? Oh, an M. Molinism? Yeah, predestination, that is a big word. It appears in the biblical text, Ephesians 1, and also in Romans. That can be a loaded term because sometimes we bring our own preconception of what predestination means when we read the biblical text. There are Christian scholars that have their own views on that, and I perceive that with the no time left for us, that maybe over lunch we can chat more about that. And I could spend hours just talking about the different views on predestination. So, good. If there are questions, of course, I'll be around for lunch so we can chat more about.
Yeah, you can also put it in the hat of inquiry.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. J. And of course, he's here all week. So
yeah, not just today,
ask more questions.